The Worm versus the Bin. Chaos unleashed. The worm slithered confidently into the room, its small body glistening under the dim lights. In its tiny hands, it carried a stack of rare Albanian postal stamps, holding them aloft like a trophy. It was proud, perhaps too proud, and it bounced around with childlike excitement, ready to show off its collection. "I am the greatest," the worm exclaimed in Mandarin, its voice full of energy. "I crawl across the earth, collecting treasures no one else can. These Albanian stamps, priceless. Everyone envies me." It paused to wave one of the stamps dramatically. "And you're just a bin. Silent, useless, forgotten. You can't even speak. What could you possibly do to challenge me?" The bin stood motionless in the corner, its metal surface gleaming faintly. It gave no response. The worm scoffed and continued. "Are you scared of me?" the worm taunted, laughing. "You think your silence can intimidate me? I have stamps, I have wisdom, I have power. And you're just full of trash." The worm slithered closer, its confidence growing. "I'm a legend. My collection will outshine the stars. You're nothing but a dull, lifeless object." But as the worm prattled on, something began to change. The air in the room grew colder. The shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally toward the worm. The bin remained still, but an oppressive darkness began to seep from its edges. The worm faltered, its voice wavering. What is this? Why does it feel so cold?" It looked around nervously, its earlier bravado fading. "My stamps, where are my stamps?" The bin did not move. It did not speak. But the darkness it emanated grew thicker, heavier. The worm's mind began to cloud, its thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. It stammered in Mandarin, its words losing coherence. I don't understand. This isn't right. My stamps. I need my stamps." The worm's tiny body trembled as it clutched its head, trying to hold on to some semblance of clarity. The room seemed to warp around it, the walls twisting and bending in impossible ways. The bin remained as it was, silent, unmoving, yet impossibly powerful. The worm was on the verge of collapse when the door to the room suddenly burst open. A loud, drunken voice bellowed, What's all this then? A rap battle, eh?" A man staggered into the room, his breath reeking of whiskey. He was clearly Scottish, his slurred words barely coherent. He stumbled toward the stage, waving an empty bottle in one hand. All right, let me show ye how it's done," he declared, nearly tripping over himself. The worm looked up, confused and terrified. "Who are you?" it managed to stutter, its voice barely audible. The Scottish man hiccuped and pointed at the worm. "I'm your worst nightmare, wee wormy. And I've got the rhymes to prove it." He attempted to clear his throat, but let out a loud burp instead. "You think you're clever, crawling around with your wee stamps," the man slurred. "But let me tell ye, your brain's as tiny as your body. I'm the king of this here battle. Ye can't even keep your thoughts straight." The worm tried to respond, but its words were lost in a jumble of fear and confusion. The bin's dark energy continued to envelop the room, its silent power growing stronger. The Scottish man turned to the bin, his drunken bravado faltering for a moment. "And what about you, eh? A bin with no voice? That's just plain creepy." He laughed nervously, but his laughter quickly died as the shadows crept toward him. "Wait, what's happening? This isn't right." The bin's lid shifted slightly, and the dark energy surged forward, wrapping around both the worm and the drunken man. The Scottish man stumbled, his bottle falling to the floor. "Oh no, nay, this isn't what I signed up for," he cried, his voice breaking into a desperate slur. The worm screamed in Mandarin, clutching its head as its mind splintered further. The Scottish man fell to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows consumed them both, dragging them into a realm of madness from which there was no escape. As the room fell silent, the bin stood unmoving, its dark power receding. The worm and the Scottish man were left broken, their minds lost to the void. The bin had won, not through words or action, but through its silent, unrelenting presence. In the stillness that followed, the bin's lid lifted ever so slightly, as if in triumph, before settling back into place. The room was empty now, save for the quiet hum of darkness lingering in the air. The toilet bowl was an imposing monument of white porcelain, Gleaming under the harsh fluorescence of the bathroom is single flickering light. Its surface was pristine, almost too clean, save for the faintest ring of limescale near the waterline, a ghostly reminder of time's passage. The bowl sat in quiet authority, dominating the small, tiled room with its stillness, its curved edges smooth and flawless, leading the eye inevitably toward the drain, a dark abyss that promised only finality. Inside the bowl, the water was unnaturally clear, almost glass-like, disturbed only by the occasional ripple that sent soft, concentric waves outward. The ripples weren't caused by movement. They were simply there, a product of some invisible force. Floating within this silent pool were the poos, silent, nameless, and indistinguishable from one another. Each poo bobbed gently on the surface, its soft, irregular shape casting faint shadows on the porcelain below. One drifted closer to the edge, nudged slightly by a subtle current. Another rested near the drain, its stillness almost uncanny, as though it were waiting for something. A third moved in slow, lazy circles, brushing briefly against the others before resuming its solitary course. The bathroom itself was sterile and featureless, its walls tiled in an unremarkable shade of off-white. The grout between the tiles was clean, but not spotless, speckled here and there with faint stains that no scrubbing could fully erase. The floor tiles were colder, their surfaces dull and uneven, with a faint hairline crack spidering out from beneath the base of the toilet. Above the bowl, the lid was closed but slightly askew, as though it had been left ajar in a moment of haste. The handle on the side of the tank gleamed faintly, a single bead of condensation clinging to its edge before sliding down to the base. The tank itself hummed softly, an ever-present reminder of the plumbing's latent power. The air in the bathroom was heavy, not with any unpleasant smell, but with an unshakable sense of foreboding. The flickering light above cast shifting shadows that danced across the walls and the water, distorting the shapes of the poos as they floated in the bowl. And yet, despite the eerie stillness, there was a sense of history here, a connection to the events that had transpired just beyond this room. The Chinese worm, once so full of life and bravado, had been reduced to madness by the silent power of the bin in the adjacent space. The Scottish man's drunken slurs and chaotic rhymes were now echoes of the past, swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed the worm's mind. Somehow, the toilet bowl felt like an extension of that strange, unknowable force, a new stage for its quiet malevolence. The poos, floating aimlessly within its waters, were perhaps witnesses, or perhaps they were something more. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in this small, featureless room. The poos remained as they were, unmoving except for the occasional ripple that disturbed the water's surface. The shadows flickered and shifted, and the faint hum of the plumbing filled the air, a monotonous drone that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the stillness within the bowl. But here, in this silent, sterile chamber, the poos drifted in their endless, aimless existence, their presence a quiet echo of the madness that had unfolded before. The Tesco till beeped monotonously, each sound like a drip of water on stone, eroding Dean's already fragile grasp on reality. His manager Cheryl's voice faded into the background, as he scanned tins of soup and loaves of bread, the motions automatic, the weight of his thoughts heavy. Harold the Worm had consumed him lately. His strange, dark protagonist had begun to feel less like a creation and more like an echo of something real. It had started with the bin. The bin in Dean's garden was nothing special, or so it seemed. It was an old black wheelie bin, cracked near the base, perpetually damp despite weeks of no rain. It sat at the far end of the overgrown yard, half hidden by nettles and brambles. For years, Dean had paid it no mind, dumping his rubbish in it without a second thought. But lately, it had started to feel wrong. It was always there, just in the corner of his eye, as though it had moved slightly closer to the house overnight. Sometimes, he thought he heard it creak softly, as if shifting its weight. Once, late at night, Dean swore he saw a faint, sickly green light seeping from its edges. He told himself it was a dream, but he didn't go into the garden after dark anymore. The more he avoided the bin, the more Harold the Worm took over his thoughts. Harold wasn't just a character anymore. He was an obsession. Dean began sketching him feverishly, filling notebook after notebook with jagged, frantic lines. Harold's once goofy grin had warped into something twisted. His tiny glasses cracked and askew. In the latest iteration of Harold's story, he was no longer a crusader for justice. He was a demented, cognitively impaired worm who lived beneath an apartment building slated for demolition. The building had been sold to McDonald's, and Harold, with his broken mind, clung desperately to the few memories he had left of the place. The smell of damp plaster, the muffled sounds of arguments above, and the occasional rain of crumbs from his upstairs neighbors. In the story, Harold's madness wasn't his fault. Something dark had seeped into his world, twisting his thoughts and unraveling his reality. Dean wrote about Harold's frantic attempts to warn the world about the demolition. Though his warnings were incoherent and ignored, he described Harold screaming into the void as his home crumbled around him, his cries swallowed by an unseen force. Dean knew where the darkness in Harold's story had come from. It was the bin. He had woven the bin into Harold's tale, casting it as the silent antagonist, a vessel for ancient, unknowable powers. Harold would stumble across the bin in the final act, realizing too late that it had been warping his mind all along, its dark influence seeping into his every thought. Dean couldn't shake the feeling that the bin in his garden was doing the same to him. The parallels between his life and Harold's were becoming too strong to ignore. Dean lived alone in a crumbling flat, his life as monotonous and unchanging as Harold's. The garden bin loomed over him, just as it loomed over Harold's unraveling mind. Even now, as Dean scanned groceries and smiled weakly at customers, he could feel the bin's presence in the back of his mind, a silent, suffocating weight. That night, Dean returned home to his dimly lit flat. The notebooks piled on his desk seemed to hum with an energy of their own, the pages filled with frantic scribbles of Harold screaming, Harold laughing, Harold descending into madness. Dean stared at the sketches, his hand trembling as he reached for his pen. He glanced out the window. The bin was there, barely visible in the shadows of the overgrown garden. Its dark silhouette seemed larger than before, its edges sharper, more defined. Dean thought he saw it shift, just slightly, as though it were waiting for him. He turned back to his desk and began to write. Harold the worm, the demented philatelist, stood before the bin in the ruins of his demolished home. The bin did not speak, but Harold could feel its presence, its power pressing down on him like a crushing weight. Harold screamed, his words incoherent, his tiny mind unable to comprehend the enormity of what he faced. Dean's pen moved faster, the lines on the page growing darker and more erratic. The bin's lid opened, and a wave of darkness spilled out, enveloping Harold in its void. His screams turned to laughter, and then to silence. Dean dropped his pen, his breath coming in short gasps. He turned toward the window, but the bin was no longer there. It was closer. Much closer. The break room was dim, the vending machine casting a pale glow across the scuffed linoleum floor. Cheryl leaned against the counter, a bright red and blue elf bar clutched between her fingers, puffing out artificial clouds of vaguely fruity vapor. Dean sat at the rickety table, hunched over a stack of Harold the Worm sketches. His hands moved absently beneath the table, fishing around in his waistband. Every so often, he pulled out a clinker, small, crusty fragments of something unpleasant, and flicked it onto the growing pile on the floor beside him. Cheryl wrinkled her nose as she exhaled a plume of Red Bull-flavored mist. "Dean," she said, her voice sharp, "you've been absolutely useless lately. You're slow on the tills, distracted. I've had 3 complaints today about you scanning things twice. What's your excuse this time?" Dean didn't look up. He extracted another clinker, flicked it onto the pile, and muttered, "I'm working on something important." "Important?" Cheryl scoffed, tapping the elf bar against her palm like it was a cigarette. "You call scribbling about a worm and a bin important? While I'm out there picking up your slack, you're back here pulling God knows what out of your pants and calling it art." Dean's grip on his sketches tightened, his face pale. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Cheryl shot back. "You've got your head so far up your own arse with this worm nonsense that you've forgotten you've got a job to do." "A job, Dean? Not a bloody art retreat." Dean looked up at her then, his eyes dark. "It's not just nonsense," he said. "Harold the Worm isn't just a story. He's me. He's us. He's everyone who's ever been crushed by something bigger than them." Cheryl took a long drag on her vape, the Red Bull scent filling the air as she exhaled sharply. "Oh, spare me the philosophy, Dean. Harold's a worm, and you're a Tesco cashier who can't even clean up his own till. What's next?" Gonna tell me that bin in the garden is out to get you? Dean's jaw tightened. He reached under his waistband, pulled out another clinker, and flicked it harder than usual, the tiny lump bouncing off the floor with a faint clink. You think this is funny, he said, his voice rising. You think I'm making this up? That bin isn't just a bin, Cheryl. It's something wrong. It's alive. It's watching me. It's in my head. Cheryl raised an eyebrow, smirking around her vape. The bin is watching you. Right. And I suppose Harold the worm is your way of fighting back. Drawing pictures of a cognitively impaired worm collecting stamps is your grand rebellion against the dark forces of a wheelie bin. You don't get it, Dean snapped, standing suddenly. His sketches fluttered to the floor as he gestured wildly. Harold isn't just a worm. He's a symbol. A warning. The bin is real, Cheryl, and it's coming for all of us. Cheryl exhaled another cloud of vapor, her smirk growing. You've lost it, you know that. Properly lost it. Harold's not a hero, Dean. He's a bloody worm. And that bin. It's just a bin. A piece of plastic. It's not warping your mind. It's holding rubbish. Like your ideas. Dean's hands balled into fists. You think you're so clever, don't you? Sitting there with your elf bar, judging me. You don't even see it, Cheryl. You're already under its spell. That bin doesn't just sit there. It's working on you. On all of us. Cheryl laughed, the sound harsh and sharp. Oh, yeah, sure. The evil bin's got me vaping Red Bull and running Tesco like a prison warden. That's its master plan, is it? Warping the minds of middle managers one puff at a time. Dean stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You can laugh all you want, but when the bin comes for you, don't say I didn't warn you. Cheryl leaned forward, her smirk fading slightly as she locked eyes with him. You're treading on thin ice, Dean. Keep this up, and I'll chuck those notebooks in the bin myself. How's that for poetic justice? Dean didn't reply. He stared at her for a long moment before bending to gather his sketches, his movements stiff and jerky. Without another word, he turned and left the break room, the door swinging shut behind him. Cheryl leaned back against the counter, taking another drag on her vape. For a moment, the Red Bull flavor tasted faintly metallic, almost bitter. She glanced at the pile of clinkers on the floor, then out the window. In the shadowy loading dock, the bin sat still and silent, its edges barely visible in the dim light. Cheryl shook her head, muttering to herself, "Bloody idiot." But as she turned away, she couldn't help but glance back one last time.